New York, the city that never sleeps. Millions of people, countless stories. But today we will tell the story of a woman who surprised everyone. Amid the incessant hustle and bustle of New York, there was a presence that went unnoticed by many, yet carried a deep and remarkable story. Margaret, an 80-year-old woman, walked slowly through the streets, her steps tired but firm. Her eyes, though hidden behind a tangle of gray hair, reflected a past of glory and a present of challenges. Her hands, once skilled in the culinary arts, now held a worn-out bag, filled with memories and few possessions. She was an almost invisible figure, blending into the urban landscape of concrete and indifference. Margaret found shelter in a small space under a bridge, where she improvised her home with cardboard boxes and old blankets. Every night, she lit a small candle, not just to illuminate the darkness around her, but to keep the flame of her memories alive. The flickering flame cast dancing shadows, retelling the days of her youth and success. Margaret was not just another soul forgotten by society. Decades ago, she was a renowned chef whose gastronomic creations delighted palates and received applause in sophisticated restaurants. Her passion for cooking was unparalleled, and her name was once synonymous with excellence and innovation. However, life has its unpredictable turns, and a series of unfortunate events led her from stardom to the solitude of the streets. Despite everything, Margaret never lost her dignity. Her eyes still shone with the same intensity as before, and her upright posture demonstrated an unshakable inner strength. She befriended the birds that came to keep her company during the day, and the few passers-by who greeted her with a smile. Margaret held her head high, knowing that her true essence could not be measured by her current circumstances. And so Margaret lived day by day, invisible to many, but with a story etched in the lines of her face and the depth of her eyes. She walked the streets of New York as a silent witness to what life can create and undo. Her journey was a constant reminder that behind every face, there is a story, often more extraordinary than we can imagine. On a cold winter night, the twinkling lights of the La Belle Epoque restaurant illuminated the Manhattan sidewalk. The restaurant was an icon of luxury and elegance, where the crème de la crème of society gathered to enjoy exquisite dishes and refined conversations. The glass doors revealed a lavish interior, decorated with crystal chandeliers and tables adorned with impeccably white linen tablecloths. Inside, the murmur of sophisticated conversations blended with the soft sound of a piano in the background. Margaret, drawn by the warmth and the memories that such an environment brought, decided to enter. With hesitant steps, she crossed the door, immediately feeling the contrast between her tattered coat and the restaurant's opulent glow. The hostess, accustomed to welcoming magnates and celebrities, gave her a perplexed look. Silence took over the place for a brief moment, as all eyes turned to the unexpected figure who had just entered. The patrons, dressed in high couture suits and gowns, began to whisper and stifle laughs. To them, Margaret's presence was an affront to the exclusivity of the place. "What is a homeless woman doing here?" whispered a woman with a champagne glass in hand. The disdainful comments and contemptuous looks multiplied, transforming the previously welcoming atmosphere into a current of veiled hostility. But Margaret was undeterred. With her head held high and a firm gaze, she walked to the center of the hall. Each step was a silent declaration of her dignity and courage. She approached the bar, where the bartender observed her with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. "May I sit here?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying the authority of years of experience and resilience. The restaurant owner, drawn by the commotion, emerged from his office to see what was happening. Upon recognizing Margaret, he was paralyzed for a moment. It was impossible to mistake that face, even after all these years. With a mix of surprise and reverence, he addressed her. "Ms. Hamilton, it is an honor to have you here," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The silence in the hall was instant, followed by murmurs of surprise and shame. At that moment, everyone realized that the woman they had despised was, in fact, a living legend. The door of La Belle Epoque opened slowly, and the soft sound of the piano was interrupted by a brief silence. Margaret entered, hesitant but with an innate dignity that defied her worn appearance. The environment was filled with laughter, lively conversations, and the clinking of crystal glasses. The opulence of the place starkly contrasted with the frail figure that had just crossed the threshold, creating a palpable tension in the air. All eyes turned to her. Customers, waiters, and even the pianist, who let his hands rest on the keys for a moment, fixed their gaze on the elderly woman entering that sanctuary of luxury. The murmurs began to spread like wildfire. Who let her in? This is unacceptable. What is a beggar doing here? Those words, full of disdain and incredulity, ricocheted off the gilded walls, creating an atmosphere of collective judgment. Margaret kept her head held high, her eyes fixed on the bar at the back of the hall. Every step she took seemed to echo in the silence that formed around her. Her worn shoes resounded against the polished marble, a constant reminder of her condition. The stifled laughter and contemptuous looks only reinforced the inner strength she carried. She advanced with the same determination that had guided her in the kitchen years ago, when her only concern was creating something beautiful and delicious. As Margaret approached the bar, the tension in the air increased. The waiters, initially ready to intervene, hesitated when they saw the determination in her eyes. The bartender, a young man with neatly combed hair and an impeccable uniform, watched the scene with a mix of curiosity and caution. When she finally reached the counter, he was speechless. "May I sit here?" she asked, her voice sounding like a gentle breeze, but carrying the authority of years of experience and resilience. The bartender nodded, still speechless, offering her a seat with a respectful gesture. It was at this moment that the restaurant owner, alerted by the commotion, appeared. A middle-aged man, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. He looked at Margaret and froze. Recognizing her immediately, his eyes widened in a mix of surprise and reverence. "Ms. Hamilton," he said, his voice breaking the silence and echoing through the hall. "Is it really you?" The instant recognition brought a wave of shock and shame among the patrons. Suddenly, the laughter ceased, and the whispers turned into murmurs of incredulity. The woman they had all despised was, in fact, a living legend, and her entrance into the restaurant was not a mistake, but a moment of revelation. The silence that followed the restaurant owner's identification of Margaret was almost deafening. The customers, who moments before had been immersed in laughter and conversations, now faced the scene with expressions of shock and embarrassment. Those who had mocked and whispered felt a chill down their spines as they realized the magnitude of their error. The atmosphere of disdain and contempt quickly transformed into a mix of shame and curiosity. An elegantly dressed woman, who had previously whispered sarcastic comments to her companion, covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with regret. "My God, is it really her?" she whispered, her voice now full of admiration. The man beside her, who had laughed along with her, now stared intently at Margaret, trying to process the revelation. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his laughter now a distant and embarrassing memory. The murmuring in the restaurant began to grow, but this time it was a sound of recognition and respect. People exchanged glances, quietly discussing the culinary legend among them. Some discreetly took out their phones to research more about Margaret Hamilton, the chef who had once conquered the world with her gastronomic creations. She was on the streets all this time? How could we have been so insensitive? These were questions that hung in the air, laden with guilt and admiration. A young couple sitting near the bar watched everything with eyes shining with reverence. "She is a true inspiration," the young woman said, squeezing her partner's hand. "She achieved so much, and yet we treated her as nothing." The partner nodded, his eyes full of respect. "We need to do something to make this right," he replied, his gaze returning to Margaret with renewed determination. This sentiment began to spread among the patrons, a desire to correct their mistake and honor this extraordinary woman. Margaret, sitting at the bar, felt the change in the environment. The looks that had once been disdainful were now filled with admiration and respect. The restaurant owner, still by her side, gestured to the waiters. "Treat her with the honor she deserves," he said, his voice firm and full of conviction. The waiters, previously hesitant, now moved quickly and precisely, bringing the finest dishes and wines for Margaret. The 80-year-old woman, who had entered as an unknown, was now the center of attention. A living reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that respect and dignity are rights for everyone. The restaurant owner, still surprised and emotional about Margaret's presence, took the initiative to clarify the situation to everyone present. He stepped onto a small platform near the bar and asked for everyone's attention. The murmuring in the hall ceased, and all eyes turned to him. With a voice that mixed reverence and enthusiasm, he began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have the honor of having a true legend among us. Allow me to introduce Margaret Hamilton, one of the greatest chefs this country has ever known. The customers, who were still processing the change in attitude, were astonished. The revelation spread like wildfire. Some began to applaud, while others still seemed incredulous. "Margaret Hamilton? The Margaret Hamilton?" a man exclaimed, his voice full of surprise. The news was hard to believe. How had someone so renowned and respected ended up in those conditions? The air was filled with curiosity mixed with regret. The restaurant owner continued, briefly recounting Margaret's trajectory. He spoke about her days of glory, the restaurants she had managed, the awards she had won, and how her culinary creations had delighted thousands of palates. "Unfortunately, life has its unexpected twists," he said, with a tone of sadness in his voice. "But this does not diminish the greatness of what she has achieved. This woman here, before us, is a symbol of resilience and unparalleled talent." Margaret, sitting at the bar, felt a mix of emotions. Tears welled up in her eyes, not from shame or sadness, but from the overwhelming wave of recognition and respect now surrounding her. The restaurant owner approached her and, with a respectful gesture, helped her to stand. "Ms. Hamilton, please allow us to celebrate your presence and honor you in the manner you deserve," he said, his voice laden with sincerity. Applause filled the hall. It was a standing ovation, a collective demonstration of admiration and repentance. Margaret, with her eyes shining with emotion, smiled and waved timidly. The woman who had entered that restaurant as an unknown was now celebrated as the true legend she always was. The revelation had transformed the atmosphere of La Belle Époque, reminding everyone that a person's greatness cannot be measured merely by appearances or momentary circumstances. Margaret had regained not only her dignity but also the respect she had always deserved. As the murmuring spread through La Belle Époque, the restaurant owner, Charles Delacroix, was in his office on the upper floor, reviewing reports. The muffled sounds of conversations and laughter filled the environment, but something in the tone of the murmurs changed, catching his attention. Intrigued, Charles set his work aside and descended the stairs, curious to discover the cause of the commotion. Upon reaching the main hall, he was immediately greeted by an unusual sight: an elderly woman, dressed simply and shabbily, sitting at the bar. The scene contrasted drastically with the opulence around her. The customers, who normally would be absorbed in their gourmet meals and sophisticated conversations, were now fixated on Margaret. Charles furrowed his brow, trying to comprehend the situation. He walked quickly to the bar, where the bartender looked visibly nervous and unsure. Charles approached Margaret with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Good evening, ma'am," he said with a polite but cautious tone. "May I ask what brings you to our restaurant this evening?" Margaret lifted her eyes to meet his, and in that moment, something about her demeanor seemed familiar to him. Charles's eyes widened when he finally recognized the face of a legend he had admired for many years. "Margaret Hamilton?" His voice almost faltered as he uttered the name, filled with incredulity. The revelation was immediate and electrifying. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles announced, his voice now full of emotion, "we have the honor of being in the presence of Margaret Hamilton, one of the greatest chefs of our generation." The entire hall fell into a reverent silence, followed by murmurs of surprise and respect. Charles turned to Margaret, his gaze softened by admiration and respect. "Ms. Hamilton, it is a privilege to have you here. Please allow me to personally take care of your stay this evening." With Charles's assistance, Margaret rose from the bar stool. The looks of disdain turned into expressions of remorse and reverence. The atmosphere in the restaurant changed instantly, from cold and hostile to warm and welcoming. Charles, with a gentle gesture, led her to a central table, while the customers, one by one, stood to applaud. The woman who had been ignored and despised for so long now received the standing ovation she deserved. In that moment, La Belle Époque was not just a luxury restaurant, but a stage where true dignity and respect were restored. The standing ovation was followed by a reverent silence as everyone processed the magnitude of the moment. Margaret, visibly emotional, sat at the central table, surrounded by looks now overflowing with respect and admiration. The restaurant owner, Charles, signaled to the waiters, who promptly began serving the most sophisticated and exquisite dishes of the house. The atmosphere, which had been filled with disdain and hostility, now pulsed with an energy of redemption and honor. The customers who had been the first to mock Margaret were now determined to make amends. A middle-aged man, who had previously laughed disdainfully, stood up and approached Margaret's table. "Ms. Hamilton, please allow me to apologize for my earlier behavior. I didn't know who you were, and even so, my behavior was unacceptable. Your presence here is an honor for all of us." He extended his hand, and Margaret, with a gentle smile, shook it. An elegant woman, with tears in her eyes, approached next. "Margaret, your work inspired me to pursue a career in culinary arts. When I was young, I read about your achievements and dreamed of being like you. I am deeply ashamed of my initial behavior. Please accept my sincere apologies and my eternal gratitude." She handed Margaret a small notebook, explaining that it was a recipe book inspired by Margaret's dishes. The atmosphere in the restaurant transformed into a space of celebration and reconciliation. The customers not only apologized but also expressed their admiration and gratitude for the living legend among them. With each interaction, Margaret's expression softened even more, and her tears of emotion were a mix of joy and relief. She had spent years in obscurity, and now, in a single night, her story and legacy were being restored before her eyes. Charles, observing the scene, felt deeply moved. He knew that Margaret's presence that night had changed not only her life's course, but also the perspective of everyone present. "Ms. Hamilton," he said, approaching with a smile, "this restaurant will always have its doors open for you. Please make yourself at home." Margaret, with eyes shining with gratitude, replied, "Thank you. Tonight you have not only fed me, but also restored my faith in humanity." And so, La Belle Époque was not just a stage of high gastronomy that night, but also a place where dignity and respect were fully restored. As the night progressed, La Belle Époque was filled with a new kind of energy. Margaret Hamilton's story had touched the hearts of everyone present, and the transformation in the environment was palpable. The customers continued to approach Margaret, sharing personal stories of how her culinary creations had inspired, moved, and connected them with their own journeys. The restaurant, which once seemed a symbol of exclusivity, had become a space of unity and reflection. Margaret, surrounded by people who now treated her with the dignity and respect she had always deserved, felt invigorated. She smiled, laughed, and even shed a few tears of joy as she listened to the sincere words of the customers. "I never imagined a night could change so much," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You all have reminded me of the impact we can have on each other's lives, even when we think our time has passed." Charles, observing everything, decided to make a toast. He raised his wine glass and called for everyone's attention. "To this memorable night and the incredible Margaret Hamilton," he said, his voice echoing through the hall. "May her story remind us that we all have value, regardless of our circumstances. Let us never judge a book by its cover and always seek the true essence of the people around us." The glasses were raised, and a chorus of "To Margaret" filled the air, followed by enthusiastic applause. The customers began to disperse, but the lesson of the night remained etched in their hearts. Many left with a new perspective, determined to treat everyone they encountered with more compassion and respect. "Margaret's story changed something inside me," a young woman said as she left. "I'll strive to see beyond appearances and value the true essence of people." Margaret, now sitting alone at her table, watched the last people leaving the restaurant. Charles approached and sat beside her. "You did more than just enter a restaurant tonight," he said. "You changed lives." Margaret smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Perhaps it was fate," she replied, "but tonight I regained something I thought I had lost forever." And with that, La Belle Époque became a symbol not only of luxury and culinary excellence, but also of humanity and redemption, a place where true dignity was restored and celebrated. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. See you next time. If this story inspired you, imagine what else is waiting for you. Don't miss out. Hit the subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and explore more powerful stories on our channel. Your next favorite video could be just a click away.